Some men build walls so high that even they can no longer escape from within. Nathan Carter was that kind of man, as tough as the land he worked, as cold as the nights he faced alone. He needed a wife. She needed a home, nothing more, at least. That's what they both told themselves, until Isabella arrived, with a small suitcase, a quiet smile, and a heart full of untold stories. She didn't try to win him over. She didn't ask for love. But the way she existed, calm, steady, sweet, began to crack open the fortress he called his chest. And what began with uncomfortable silences, accidental bumps, and nights spent reading by candlelight, soon became something impossible to control. Get ready to dive into a story where desire is born from waiting, love blooms from the unexpected, and the warmth of a touch changes everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing more emotional stories like this one. Share with someone special. The sun dipped low on the horizon as the old wooden cart groaned to a stop in front of the Carter farmhouse. The sky blazed with shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows over the dry land, where the tall grasses whispered secrets to the wind. Dust swirled from the wheels, settling over Isabella's weathered dress as she slowly stood up, taking in the place she was meant to call home. The house stood tall before her, a dark and weathered structure of wood, silent in its judgment. Its tall windows were tightly shut, as if refusing to acknowledge her. There were no flowers, no welcome mat, no signs of life, just a vast golden emptiness that seemed to engulf the farmhouse like a quiet warning. Isabella gripped the worn leather handle of her suitcase tightly, her fingers trembling, and stepped down cautiously. Her boots sank slightly into the dry earth. The air was thick with the smell of dust, hay, and something metallic, like distance made solid. A man stood on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and messy brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. Nathan Carter. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms streaked with the dirt of hard work. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply stood there with eyes that were as unreadable as the soil he worked. "So you're Isabella?" he asked, his voice rough and low, lacking even a hint of warmth. It was more like a check on the arrival of a long-expected package than a greeting. She nodded, her throat tight, before she managed to answer, "Yes, I'm Isabella." He took a second longer than she felt comfortable with to look her over. Then, without offering a handshake, a smile, or any gesture of kindness, he gave a slight flick of his head toward the door. This way. That was it. No greeting. No questions about her journey, no warmth. Isabella followed him up the wooden steps, the boards creaking beneath her, as if they too resented her presence. She glanced back once at the setting sun, its light slipping away as if it were taking with it the last remnants of her hopes for a soft beginning. Inside, the house was dim and functional. Shadows clung to every corner. The floor was clean but bare. The air was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in days. There was no scent of home, no flowers, no cinnamon, no sense of life. Just the faint, sharp odor of old wood and isolation. Nathan stepped aside, vaguely motioning down a hallway. "Your room's the first on the left, mine's at the end." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't offer to help with her suitcase. He simply walked past her, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floorboards, and disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen. She stood alone for a moment, her heart thumping in her chest. The silence was so loud it seemed to echo in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her bag as she stepped into the room he had pointed to. It was small but neat. A single bed, with plain white sheets, a wooden dresser, and a narrow window overlooking the back fields. The walls were bare, as if afraid to show any sign of emotion. She sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. This was not what she had imagined. Not that she had dreamed of romance or a soft landing. She was realistic. She'd come because she needed a place to belong, needed the stability that this marriage of convenience could offer. A roof, a name, a fresh start. But still, something in her had hoped for at least a glimmer of kindness. Instead, she'd been welcomed like a hired hand, no more, no less. Later they sat at a wooden table for dinner. A plate of roasted vegetables and overcooked meat sat between them. The only sounds were the soft clinks of silverware and the occasional crackle from the fire in the stone hearth nearby. Nathan didn't look at her. He ate in silence, his head slightly bowed as if she weren't even there. When he finished, he stood, pushed his chair back with a scrape and nodded toward the hallway. "Don't expect anything from me," he said. "I needed a wife. You needed shelter. That's the deal." Then, without another word, he walked off. The silence returned, deeper now. He hadn't asked her a thing. Not about her past, not about her needs, not about who she was beneath the name Isabella. Left alone at the table, she stared at the half-eaten food on her plate. Her chest felt tight, but no tears came. She would not cry. She would not beg for affection. That had never worked before, and it would not work now. Instead, she rose, cleared the dishes in silence, and disappeared into the quiet of her room. But even as she lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refused to come, and in that silence, something stirred. Thought, a question, a quiet defiance that slowly began to take root. The door to her room clicked shut softly, and the silence enveloped her completely. Isabella leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, trying to steady the knot twisting in her chest. The room was still, almost holding its breath. She set her suitcase on the bed and ran her fingers across the wooden dresser, dust-free but lifeless. The walls, bare and colorless, reminded her of the orphanage, sterile, functional, untouched by affection. She placed her few belongings on the dresser with delicate care. A scarf, a hairbrush, a worn copy of one of her favorite books, romance, of course. Her fingers lingered on its cover, a small token of warmth in this cold unknown. A soft creak in the hallway reminded her she wasn't alone in the house. Downstairs, Nathan moved like a shadow, silent, heavy, unspeaking. Isabella freshened up, quickly, and changed into a simple dress, the fabric clinging slightly to her waist before falling into soft pleats. She didn't dress for seduction, just for dignity. Then, gathering her courage like a fragile thread, she walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, where the firelight flickered dimly across the floor. Nathan was already at the table, eating. The room smelled faintly of roasted potatoes and overcooked meat. No candles, no soft music, not even a second plate set for her. When she stepped inside, he didn't look up. Isabella hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to interrupt. Eventually, she cleared her throat gently. He didn't respond, but without speaking, he pushed a second plate forward, already served, already cooling. It was a silent command. Eat. She sat across from him, the wooden chair creaking softly. The food was bland, but she was too tense to taste much of anything. The clinks of silverware filled the silence. Occasionally the fire popped, like it was the only thing brave enough to speak in that room. She stole a glance at him. Nathan was focused on his plate, jaw tense, eyes unreadable. Everything about him felt closed off, locked away. She couldn't find the key, and part of her wasn't sure she even wanted to try yet. Finally, he spoke, without lifting his gaze. "Don't create expectations." His words hit her like ice water down her spine. "I needed a wife," he continued, still not looking at her. "You needed a roof. Let's keep it simple." There was no venom in his voice, but also no space for emotion. It was mechanical, as if he were reading from a contract neither of them had signed willingly. She set her fork down. "I understand." It was all she could say. Pride wrapped itself around her voice like armor. After the meal, he stood again, pointing toward the hallway. "For your room's yours, the other room's mine." And with that, he was gone. No good night, no small talk, just his footsteps retreating into the silence. Isabella stayed alone at the table, the fire casting trembling shadows across her face. She sat there for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her spine stiff but her heart aching. She wasn't surprised by his coldness. Still, something in her chest had hoped for at least acknowledgement, a flicker of humanity. Even animals show curiosity when a stranger enters their territory. Nathan had shown none. She gathered the dishes and washed them by hand. The water was lukewarm, the soap barely scented, But the repetitive motion calmed her. Scrub, rinse, dry. At least, this she could control. She cleaned the kitchen until everything sparkled, not for him, but for herself. To claim some small piece of this house as hers, even if it was just the clean curve of a plate or the quiet gleam of the sink. By the time she returned to her room, the fire had burned low, and the wind whispered against the windows. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The mattress was firm, the blanket coarse. Still, she made no complaints. This was better than the street, better than the orphanage, better than the room she'd rented in town where the walls were paper-thin and safety was never certain. But better didn't mean easy, and it certainly didn't mean love. She rolled to her side, clutching the pillow, listening to the wind. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed, probably Nathan's. It sounded final, like a line drawn in the sand. She thought of the way he had spoken, controlled, distant, as if he'd built walls so high no one had ever dared to climb them. Or maybe they had and failed. Maybe someone had tried to love him once and had been turned away. Or maybe he had simply never learned what love looked like. Whatever the reason, she knew one thing: she would not beg. She had begged for love before, in the orphanage, from a string of families who saw her as a burden, not a blessing. She had begged to be chosen, to be seen, to be kept, never again. Now she would endure, but she would not plead, not even for warmth. Still, as she pulled the covers tighter around her and closed her eyes, a quiet whisper slipped through her chest. Not a cry, not a hope, just a question. What happened to him? To make him this way? And more importantly, was he still capable of being undone? The silence in the room was heavy, yet strangely comforting. It reminded Isabella of those long, quiet nights at the orphanage, when she would sneak a book under the covers and let the world fade away into someone else's story. Sleep wouldn't come, not after that dinner, not in a bed that felt more like a hospital cot than a place to rest. Her body lay still, but her mind raced, tracing Nathan's words, the coldness in his voice, the way he hadn't looked at her even once as a person. So she got up, carefully, quietly. Her bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. She wrapped herself in a thin shawl and walked down the dark hallway, carrying her worn book like a lifeline. The candle she lit flickered against the walls as she descended the stairs. The fire in the living room hearth had died down, but there was enough warmth lingering in the stones to keep the space from freezing. She settled onto the couch, folding her legs beneath her, the candle resting on a low table beside her. Shadows danced along the walls as she opened the pages. It was one of her favorite novels, intense, poetic, a story of forbidden longing and the kind of slow-burning passion that left her heart aching and full. She had read it many times before, but tonight the words felt different, closer. Too close, perhaps. She started to read silently, but eventually the words began to slip from her lips in a quiet murmur. Her voice barely rose above the crackling of the remaining embers, but there was something soothing in hearing the story aloud. Her voice was soft, melodic, a lullaby for no one. His hand trembled as it traced the silk of her gown, afraid of wanting too much, of needing what he couldn't ask for. She paused, swallowed, turned the page. The heroine in the book didn't beg either. She waited, daring him to see her, just like Isabella had wanted to be seen earlier that evening. A breeze whispered through the window pane, causing the flame to dance. Her shawl slipped from her shoulder, revealing the thin strap of her nightgown. She didn't notice. She was too caught up in the story, in the pull of it, the way desire was written into the spaces between words. Her fingers trailed absently down the curve of her own thigh, not with intention, but in a subconscious mimicry of the character's vulnerability. The heat of the room seemed to change, or perhaps it was the heat building within her, the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a moment, and in that moment, she was not alone. Nathan stood at the top of the stairs, frozen, in the shadows, drawn from his sleep by the gentle, unfamiliar sound of her voice echoing through the hallway. At first he'd been confused. then intrigued, now captivated. He didn't make a sound, he didn't move, but he watched the way her lips formed every word, like a secret being given shape. Watched the candlelight illuminate the soft curves of her body beneath the fabric, the way her fingers slid along her skin, unaware of the spell she was casting. She looked like a dream he had never dared to have, innocent, intimate, real, and he couldn't look away. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He didn't want to feel this, didn't want this. Desire was dangerous. It made men weak, it made them forget. And he had built his entire life around control, around making sure that no one ever got close enough to undo him. But this woman, this stranger he had brought into his home for convenience, was shattering. His walls with nothing but a book and her breathless voice. Down below, Isabella turned another page. Her eyes glittered with emotion as she read. She wasn't asking to be loved, just to be seen. She whispered it, almost as if it had slipped from her own soul rather than the page, and Nathan's breath caught in his chest, because for the first time he saw her, not the arrangement, not the obligation. Her Isabella, and she was beautiful. Not just in body, though that truth was impossible to ignore, but in presence. In the way she carried quiet pain with dignity, in how she made a house full of silence feel for a moment like home. He took one step back, and then another. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, temptation. He didn't go to her, not yet, but that night he didn't sleep because the sound of her voice still echoed through the walls, and he knew she wasn't going to be easy to ignore. Nathan had always been a light sleeper, but that night sleep didn't even try to find him. His body lay still, but his mind replayed the melody of her voice over and over again, soft, breathy, trembling at the edges, as if it was barely meant to be heard. And yet it had found him, wrapped itself around his ribs and refused to let go. He tossed the blanket aside. The air in his room was cold, but not enough to calm the burning that had ignited in his veins. He had never wanted this. Not the warmth, not the ache, not the maddening curiosity about a woman who wasn't supposed to be anything more than an arrangement. He stood, pacing the wooden floor of his room, his hand dragged through his already disheveled hair. Every step seemed louder in the quiet house, and still that voice lingered. Her voice. He had meant to ignore her, had meant to keep everything clean and distant, but that voice, God, that voice, had undone something in him. Eventually, he stepped into the hallway, drawn like a moth to a flame he wasn't ready to admit existed. At the top of the stairs, he paused, and there she was, Isabella, seated on the couch in her thin nightgown, a book open on her lap, a candle flickering beside her like it, too, was held in suspense by her words. Nathan stayed in the shadows, hidden, breath shallow. The fire had died completely, but the warmth in that room came from her. It pulsed from her skin like quiet magic. Her hair was loose, cascading down her back in gentle waves. Her nightgown, though modest, clung to her like a second skin. One strap had fallen off her shoulder, revealing the slope of her collarbone and the upper curve of her chest, rising and falling with each breath she took as she read. She wasn't performing, she wasn't trying, and that's what made it so damn unbearable. There was no seduction in her eyes. They were lost in the story, but her voice was silk and sin and safety all at once. He stood there watching her sleep, realizing too late that he had already fallen. Nathan's heart clenched. Isabella turned another page, her lips parting slightly as she read, completely, unaware that she had an audience. Her legs shifted, revealing a flash of skin that made something primal inside him stir. His hands curled into fists. He had been alone for so long, too long, the kind of alone that makes a man forget what softness feels like, what connection sounds like. He could smell her from where he stood, lavender and something warm and womanly. It floated down the hallway like a trap meant just for him. His gaze dropped to the delicate line of her neck, to the way her fingers traced the book's pages with reverence. She had no idea how she looked, no idea what she was doing to him. She wasn't trying to seduce him, And that made her all the more dangerous because she didn't have to. Nathan stepped back into the shadows, heart pounding. He couldn't keep looking, but he also couldn't unsee what he had just witnessed. He had brought her here thinking she would take up space, fill a role, maybe soften the image of a man too harsh for most. What he hadn't expected was her silence, to speak louder than any woman's words ever had. What he hadn't prepared for was to feel anything at all. Back in his room, he splashed cold water on his face. His reflection stared back at him like a stranger, eyes too alert, jaw too tight. "You're losing your mind," he muttered, but it wasn't madness. It was desire, real, unfiltered, and rising fast like a storm he couldn't outrun. He lay in bed, fists clenched, the image of her burned behind his eyelids, the soft curve of her legs, the breathless pause in her voice when the story turned intimate, the way her eyes shimmered with longing she didn't even know she carried. He had never felt so out of control, and what terrified him most was that he hadn't even touched her yet. The morning sun broke over the horizon like a promise Nathan hadn't asked for. Light spilled across the fields, turning the dry grass into a sea of gold, but he barely noticed. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with demons he hadn't named in years. He didn't dream, he didn't sleep, he only heard her voice again and again, Isabella. He didn't even know her middle name. But he knew her scent now, lavender and candle smoke. He knew the shape of her silhouette when lit by flame. He knew the sound of her voice when it trembled on the edge of desire, and he hated how deeply he wanted to know more. Dragging himself out of bed, he threw on his shirt and headed down the hallway. He expected silence, the usual cold quiet of the house in the early morning. But what greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The kitchen was alive. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, bathing everything in gold. And there she was, Isabella, wearing a pale blue dress that hugged her waist gently and flared just enough at her hips to catch the morning breeze. She moved with an unconscious grace, back turned to him as she poured hot coffee into a ceramic mug. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few strands escaping to kiss her neck. The table was already set. Bread sliced, fresh butter, a bowl of ripe fruit, warm eggs in a ceramic dish. There was even a folded napkin beside his plate. He didn't know what stunned him more, the simple beauty of the scene or the fact that it had been done for him. When she turned, she smiled. Nothing forced, just a quiet warmth, like a light in the dark. "Good morning," she said, voice soft but sure. He blinked. "Morning," he replied, the words sticking in his throat like gravel. She pulled out a chair for him without hesitation, then returned to the stove to stir something gently. The scent of fresh bread and coffee filled the air, mixing with that damn lavender again. He sat slowly, as if afraid that one wrong move would shatter the whole illusion. Nathan didn't know how to behave in that moment. He was a man of action, of muscle and routine, not gestures and softness. He watched her move around the kitchen, graceful but efficient, as if she'd been doing this for years. But he knew she hadn't. She was adapting, making space in a home that hadn't invited her, planting seeds where the soil had gone dry long ago. And somehow she was doing it with ease. She sat across from him, folding her hands gently as she took a bite of toast. He watched her mouth move, watched the way her lips parted just slightly as she chewed, watched how the morning light caught on her cheekbones and softened everything around her. He hated how beautiful she looked. He hated how natural it felt. The silence between them wasn't the awkward emptiness of the night before. It was something else now, tighter, heavier, like the space between thunder and the moment lightning strikes. Isabella glanced at him and tilted her head slightly. "You don't have to say anything," she said gently. "I just thought maybe we could start the day with something a little warmer than silence." Her words were so simple, so reasonable, but they wrecked him, because he had no answer for kindness. He hadn't prepared for it. He had built his world around the absence of it. Nathan picked up a piece of bread and bit into it like it owed him an apology, chewed, swallowed, tried to act unaffected, but every second felt like she was peeling away another layer of armor. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally. "I know," she answered, her voice light, "but I wanted to." The words echoed in his chest like a challenge, wanting. He had forgotten what it felt like to do something, just because your heart told you to. Her smile didn't ask for anything in return. She wasn't angling for favor. She was simply being. Present. Real. And it made him feel raw in places he didn't know were still open. She reached for a slice of melon, biting into it gently, and the juice clung to her lips. Nathan looked away, jaw clenched. Everything about her was much too close, too alive, and yet he couldn't move, couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop remembering the sound of her voice from the night before, the way she had looked in the candlelight, the way her fingers had slid along her thigh like a whisper no man was meant to hear. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be out in the fields," he said, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. She looked up, surprised but not hurt. "All right," she said calmly. "Be safe." He nodded but didn't reply. As he grabbed his hat and headed for the door, he paused for half a second, his back still to her, and then, without turning around, he said, "Thank you." Then he stepped outside into the blinding sunlight, as if trying to outrun the warmth he had just felt inside. But the truth clung to him like the scent of her skin. She was under his skin now, and he wasn't ready for what that meant. The morning moved slowly after Nathan left, or maybe it just felt that way for Isabella. The light in the kitchen still shimmered golden, but something in the air had changed. She finished clearing the dishes, hands moving with instinct rather than thought. Her heart was still beating too fast, not from fear but from something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way Nathan had looked at her, just for a split second. Or maybe it was the way his voice had softened, barely but undeniably, when he said thank you. It wasn't affection, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. It was a crack, and cracks let light in. Isabella moved through the house like a woman trying to tame a space not made for softness. She opened windows, let the breeze in, brushed her fingers along bookshelves and bare walls. There was still so much silence in this place, but it no longer scared her. When the clock neared noon, she decided to prepare something for lunch, not because she had to, but because cooking had always been her quiet rebellion against coldness. Food was care, and care, whether accepted or not, left fingerprints on a home. Nathan returned around midday, dusty, sun-soaked and brooding. His shirt clung to his chest. His hair was damp with sweat. He looked rugged, commanding, like someone born from the very earth he tilled. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a different weight today, not softer but less armored. He nodded toward her, barely. Then sat at the table without a word, the same man, but not the same silence. Isabella placed a bowl of stew in front of him, fresh bread, a chilled pitcher of water. He didn't thank her, but he didn't ignore her either. As she sat across from him, the air between them crackled with unspoken thoughts. Every gesture felt amplified. When she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, when she sipped water, eyes lowering just slightly, when she licked the corner of her lip where a drop had lingered. Nathan noticed everything, and that was the problem. He couldn't stop noticing. Her fingers, her voice, her scent, her softness. He chewed slowly, trying to focus on the food, but every sound she made was too vivid. The clink of her spoon against the bowl, the quiet sigh she released as she leaned back in her chair. Even the way her dress shifted when she crossed her legs. It all unraveled something deep inside him. She wasn't trying, that's what wrecked him. She didn't move like someone aware of being watched. And yet, she was. His eyes dropped to her lips again, naturally full, curved slightly as if in thought. She tore off a piece of bread and brought it to her mouth, took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. He nearly groaned. Nathan shifted in his chair, suddenly, uncomfortable. His fork paused mid-air. Isabella looked up, curious. "Too hot?" she asked, gesturing to the bowl. He cleared his throat. "No, it's fine." She smiled faintly, amused by how stiff he sounded. "I'm glad you like it." That smile, it wasn't flirtation. It was grace. And somehow that was far more dangerous. He nodded again, looking down at his plate. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said gently. "But you don't have to stay silent either." Nathan didn't reply, not because he didn't hear, but because he didn't trust his voice. The silence stretched between them again, but it was different now. It had teeth. It had heat, and when her knee brushed against his beneath the table, just barely, it was like lightning through dry grass. Neither of them moved, neither of them acknowledged it, but in that moment, something shifted again. A breath held, pulse skipped, a door slowly creaking open, though neither one had touched the handle. Nathan stood abruptly, the chair scraping again. "I need to check the east fence," he said. Voice tight. Isabella didn't ask if it was urgent, she just nodded. And as he walked out the door, faster than necessary, she remained seated, eyes on the glass of water in front of her, heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. She hadn't touched him, hadn't planned anything. But something had been said and neither of them would be able to unhear it. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the wooden porch as Nathan returned from the fields. His boots were caked with dirt, his shirt clung to his back, and his hat sat low over his brow. He looked every bit the part of the hardened farmer, stern, distant, carved from the same dust he walked on. But inside he wasn't as steady as he appeared. His mind hadn't stopped spinning since that quiet lunch, since her knee brushed his, since she smiled, since her voice wrapped around him like silk and left him wordless. He walked into the house with deliberate calm, as if each step was a negotiation between control and desire. He wasn't sure which was winning. The living room was empty, but he heard movement upstairs. The sound of her footsteps, soft, sure, unhurried, echoed faintly down the hallway. And just as he turned toward the stairs, Isabella appeared. She was dressed in something simple, a cream-colored blouse tucked into a flowing skirt that swayed gently as she moved. Her hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, and a few strands had escaped, framing her face like soft brush strokes. She carried a quiet confidence now, not arrogance, not seduction, but a presence that filled the space like music you couldn't ignore. Nathan's breath caught. He tried to look away. He failed. "You're heading out again?" she asked, nodding, to the hat in his hand. "Meeting with some of the others down at the ridge," he replied, voice gruff. Isabella smiled. "You'll charm them with that collar?" He frowned slightly, confused. Then he looked down and realized his shirt collar was twisted, half-folded, the top button undone, his chest partially exposed and streaked with sweat and dust. He reached up instinctively to fix it, but she was already stepping closer. "Let me," she said, voice so gentle it barely touched the air. Before he could respond, before he could retreat, her fingers were at his collar. Light, careful, devastating. She reached up, straightening the fabric with slow precision. Her touch was soft, but it scorched him. Her fingertips grazed his skin, and he felt every cell in his body go still. The scent of her, lavender and something warmer now, more intimate, drifted up between them. She was close, too close, and yet not close enough. His pulse thundered in his ears. He dared not move. Her eyes flicked up to his, calm, curious, unthreatening, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. "There," she murmured, smoothing the fabric down. "Better." Nathan didn't speak, couldn't. He stared at her, at the softness of her mouth, the curve of her jaw, the vulnerability in her expression. She wasn't teasing him. She wasn't playing a game. She had no idea what she was doing to him. Or maybe she did, and that terrified him more. She began to step back, but something in him snapped, not with anger, with fear. Fear of what he might do if she stayed 1 second longer. "I have to go," he said, too quickly, stepping back like the floor had burned him. "Now." Isabella froze, blinking once, then she nodded, stepping aside. Of course, but there was a flicker in her eyes, not hurt. Not exactly, but something quieter, a question unanswered. Nathan didn't look back as he left, boots heavy on the floorboards, the door slamming shut behind him like a final word. But outside, in the blinding light of day, he stopped for just a moment. His hands trembled at his sides, because her touch was still on him, still inside him, and no amount of distance was going to erase that now. The sun bore down on the dry land like a hammer, merciless and heavy. Nathan moved through the fields with mechanical precision, his hands gripping the tools, his boots crushing the dirt, his body doing the work he'd done 1,000 times before. But nothing felt normal. His mind was a battlefield. He thrust the blade of the hoe into the soil with more force than necessary, again and again, trying to drown out the memory of her touch. But it wouldn't leave him, her fingers on his collar. The softness of her breath so close to his skin, the way her scent had slipped into his lungs and refused to leave. Every time he closed his eyes, even for a second, he saw her. Not just the version she showed the world, but the one he had glimpsed in moments she didn't know he was watching. The girl who read to herself late at night, lips parting on every word like it mattered. The girl who placed fresh bread on the table not for approval, but for kindness. The woman who touched his shirt like she cared, like he mattered. It made him furious. Because he didn't want to matter, he didn't want to feel. Desire he could handle. That was physical. Simple. It burned and then burned out. But this was worse. This was longing. Longing turned men weak. And Nathan Carter had made an art out of staying strong. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, jaw tight, breath shallow. The sky above him spun in blue silence, and the air felt too thick, as if even the wind had stopped to watch him unravel. "Damn it," he muttered, driving the blade deeper into the ground. But the earth didn't give easily. It was dry, hard, unyielding, just like him. Or so he had thought. He paused for a moment, hands resting on the handle, eyes staring out over the hills in the distance. But all he could see was her. Isabella. The way she stood in his kitchen like she belonged there. The way her eyes held quiet storms. The way her lips looked when she bit into a piece of bread and wiped the corner with the back of her hand, utterly unaware of the chaos she stirred. She didn't even know what she was doing to him. That was the most maddening part. He wanted to grab her, not out of anger, out of desperation, to shake her, to ask, "What are you doing to me?" But he wouldn't, because he wasn't that man. Not anymore. Or at least, he couldn't be. Couldn't let himself become someone ruled by need. He had built this life around order, discipline, isolation. Desire had no place in it. And yet, he dropped the hoe, breath heavy, sweat dripping down his back. The sun had begun its descent now, stretching shadows across the field. A warm breeze picked up, stirring the dust. And with it, her scent. Or maybe he imagined it. Lavender. Heat. Her skin. He rubbed a hand over his face, then muttered through gritted teeth, "Get a grip, Carter." But he couldn't. His grip was gone. And the part of him that still clung to control was slipping fast, because no matter how far he ran into the fields, Isabella had already taken root inside him. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the heat had not broken. Not outside, and certainly not within Nathan. His muscles ached, his clothes were damp with sweat, and the dust clung to his skin like punishment. Still, he stayed in the fields longer than necessary. He wasn't avoiding the work. He was avoiding her and himself. But eventually, even the stubbornness of a man like Nathan Carter had limits. He returned to the house, quiet as always. The front door creaked when he opened it. The only sound in a space too still for comfort. The air inside was cooler. The windows cracked open just enough to let the evening breeze pass through. But that wasn't what stopped him at the threshold. It was the scent. Faint. Lavender. And heat. He closed his eyes. No. Not now. He moved past the kitchen toward the back of the house where the laundry was kept. He needed clean clothes. A cold shower. Silence. But when he stepped into the small laundry room, the world tilted. There, resting on top of a folded stack of linen, was the dress, the one she had worn that morning. Pale blue. Light. Feminine. It was folded neatly, but one strap had slipped to the side like it had dropped there with a secret. His hand hovered over it. He told himself to walk away, to turn, to leave, to forget. But he didn't. His fingers touched the fabric. Soft, still warm from the late sun, still carrying her shape. And then, the scent. Lavender. And underneath it, her, that impossible warmth that lived on her skin and haunted his every thought. Nathan gritted his teeth, squeezing his eyes shut, but his resolve cracked. He lifted the dress to his face and breathed. It was a mistake. Instantly he was drowning, not in lust but in longing. His hands curled into the fabric, as if it could answer something he didn't know how to ask. As if holding this piece of her might quiet the war she'd awakened inside him. But it only made it worse. Images flooded his mind, her bare shoulders as she stirred coffee, the arch of her foot when she stretched in the living room, the softness. In her voice when she whispered lines from that book, he was unraveling and there was no one to stop it. Inferno, he muttered. Voice low and ragged. He dropped the dress, backed away from it like it was poison. Because maybe it was. He tore off his shirt and stormed to the bathroom, twisting the cold knob of the shower with a fury that surprised even him. Water hit him hard, but it didn't cool the burn. Nothing could. He braced himself against the tile, head lowered, breathing heavy. He couldn't go on like this. She was under his skin, in his veins. And worst of all, she didn't even know. Night fell slowly, draping the farmhouse in a hush that felt thicker than usual. The wind had quieted. Even the insects seemed more reserved, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Upstairs, Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, freshly, showered, skin still tingling from the cold. But there was no peace in him, only tension and memory. That dress, that scent, that voice. His jaw clenched as he stared at the darkened window. A part of him begged for rest, for escape into sleep. But he already knew he wouldn't get it. Not tonight. Not after what he'd felt in that laundry room. Not after the way her presence had slipped beneath his skin and rewired something vital. Then, he heard it. Faint. Familiar. Her voice. Downstairs. Again. Nathan froze. It wasn't loud. She wasn't reading to be heard. But that was what made it so dangerous. It wasn't for anyone else. It was hers. Private, intimate. And yet, it reached him. It always did. He stood slowly, not thinking. Just moving. Drawn. Like tied to moonlight. As he descended the stairs, he stayed close to the wall, staying in the shadows the way he had the night before. But what he saw this time shattered whatever was left of his resistance. She was in the same spot, the couch bathed in candlelight, the fire low but alive. But this time, her gown was different. She wore white, almost translucent, in the golden glow. The neckline dipped slightly. The fabric clung just enough to betray the curves of her body beneath it. Her hair was loose again, cascading over one shoulder, and her legs were tucked beneath her in a way that exposed just enough thigh to make his mouth go dry. She didn't see him. She was lost in her book, lost in the words she whispered like confessions to the dark. And he stood there, drowning in everything he had tried not to feel, her voice, her scent, the way she didn't even know she was undoing him. Nathan's heart thudded against his chest. It was too close, too real. She was reading him, and she didn't even know. He watched her lick her lips, turn the page, sigh softly. Her hand fell loosely across her lap, fingers grazing bare skin as if the story had spilled from fiction into flesh. She looked like temptation incarnate, but she wasn't trying. That's what destroyed him. She wasn't luring. She was simply being, and that was what made her unstoppable. Nathan took one, stepped forward, then another. His boots creaked against the wooden floor. Isabella startled. She turned, eyes wide, breath catching, the book slipping slightly from her hands. "Nathan," she whispered, more breath than sound. He didn't speak, didn't ask permission. He crossed the final distance between them like a man possessed, and when he reached her, he knelt, face to face, and said only one word. Don't stop." Isabella blinked, confused, but her voice obeyed before her mind could catch up. She began to read again, but this time her voice trembled differently. He was watching, and that changed everything. She read of a man who had locked away his heart for so long that even he had forgotten where he'd buried it. Of a woman who didn't try to open him but did, by simply being near. As she read, Nathan reached forward and took the book from her hands. He set it aside, then looked into her eyes. His hands were trembling when they reached for her face. And when his fingers brushed her cheek, it felt like lightning between them. Isabella didn't move, didn't breathe, and then he kissed her. The kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't slow. It was everything Nathan had been denying, urgent, raw, unfiltered. His mouth claimed hers like he had no time left to waste, like the silence between them had finally collapsed under the weight of all that unsaid wanting. And Isabella? She didn't resist. She melted into him, into the kiss, into everything they'd both been too afraid to say. His hands cupped her face with a desperation that bordered on reverence, as if he needed to convince himself she was real, that this wasn't another cruel dream designed to punish him with what he thought he didn't deserve, but she was real, and she was kissing him back with equal hunger, equal heat. Her fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer. The book slid from the couch to the floor, forgotten. The candlelight flickered wildly as his body pressed into hers, guiding her gently down against the cushions. He paused, just for a second, just to look at her. Her hair fanned across the pillow like ink spilled across paper. Her lips were parted, eyes wide with something between wonder and surrender. "You sure?" he rasped, voice low, gravel scraping. "Over fire." She nodded. But it wasn't just the nod. It was the way she reached for him, the way she whispered, "I've been sure since the moment you said nothing and still made me feel everything." That undid him. He lowered himself slowly, kissing her again, softer this time, like gratitude, like promise, like confession. His mouth moved along her jaw, down her throat, across the delicate hollow where her pulse raced. Her skin was warm, scented like lavender and courage. Her hands explored him, over muscles hardened by years of labor, across scars he never spoke of. And he let her. He let her touch every place no one else had touched, not just his body, but the broken parts of him hidden beneath it. When he lifted her nightgown over her hips, she gasped, not in fear but in awe. She had never seen someone look at her like he did, like he was starving, but also like he was home. They didn't rush. There was urgency, yes, but there was also something else, something deeper. Each kiss was a reckoning, each touch a vow. They didn't speak as their bodies moved, because they didn't have to. The moans, the sighs, the trembles, they said enough. And when it was over, when the fire had spent itself and the storm had passed, he didn't pull away. He stayed, holding her, breathing her in like a man who had finally found oxygen after drowning for years. Isabella curled into him, her fingers drawing soft shapes against his chest, and then he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it, "I'm in love with you." Her breath caught. But she didn't look surprised. She simply looked relieved. She touched his face, brushed a kiss against his jaw, and said, "I know, I've known, and I want to build something real with you. A home, a family." His heart thudded hard at the word family. He had never dared to imagine it, but with her in his arms nothing felt more possible. He looked at her, truly looked, and what he saw wasn't just beauty. It was strength, kindness. A woman who had walked into a house with no warmth and brought it to life. And now, lying beside her in the low light of that room, he knew he didn't just want her, he belonged to her, completely. The next morning brought a gentler kind of light. It filtered through the curtains in golden strands, touching everything softly, as if even the sun understood something sacred had happened in that house overnight. Nathan woke first. Isabella was still asleep beside him, Her breath steady, her body curled lightly toward his. Her skin held the warmth of the night before, and her presence beside him no longer felt foreign. It felt right. He studied her in silence. The slope of her nose, the curve of her shoulder, the peaceful expression of a woman who no longer felt alone. He hadn't known this kind of quiet could exist, not in his home, not in his heart. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, and when she stirred, her eyes opened slowly. She didn't speak at first. She just looked at him and smiled. That small, sleepy smile, unguarded, real, was all it took. Nathan exhaled as if something old had finally left his chest. "Stay," he said simply, voice still thick from sleep, her brow furrowed, amused. "I live here, remember?" He shook his head, more serious now. "I mean really stay. With me. Not as an arrangement. Not because of what we agreed, but because I want you here. Every morning. Every night. For the rest of it." Isabella's eyes glistened. She reached for his face, cupping his jaw. "I already chose you, Nathan, even when you didn't know it." He kissed her, slow and certain this time, and when they finally rose, the house was different. Not in its structure. In its spirit. He went out to the porch with her, hand in hand, and pointed toward the fields. "One day there'll be children running through that wheat," he said quietly. "A swing hanging from that tree, laughter in the air." Isabella leaned into his side, heart full. "I want all of that," she whispered, "with you." Later, as the day unfolded, she wore a light dress, soft and flowing, and moved through the house with purpose. She sang quietly as she cooked, her voice low and content. Nathan watched from the doorway, arms crossed, smiling like a man who had discovered something priceless in his own backyard. That night, she read to him again. But this time, it wasn't from a story. It was a letter she had written long ago, and never intended to send, to a man she had once dreamed of, a man who would see her, choose her, build a life with her. She looked up as she finished. "It was always you, Nathan. I just didn't know your name yet." He reached for her, pulling her gently into his lap. She settled there like she belonged, and because she did. Her legs curled around him, her head resting against his chest. He held her like a man who finally understood what love could look like. Not grand, not loud, but steady. Certain. Later, he lit a fire, and they sat together in the warmth, wrapped in each other. And for the first time in years, Nathan Carter, the man who didn't know how to love, didn't feel alone. He felt chosen. Loved. Home. Sometimes love doesn't come with promises or grand declarations. Sometimes it slips in through the back door, quiet, with the smell of coffee in the morning, a touch on the collar, a look that says, "I see you." Nathan thought he was incapable of loving. Isabella just wanted a home. But together they discovered that true love doesn't need perfection, just presence, and maybe we too need to allow ourselves to love like that, without defenses, without a script, without rushing. What about you? Do you believe someone can learn to love simply by being loved the right way? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. Where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing more touching stories like this one.